This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Freest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Creating Your Encore Life, so you can do the work you love when you want and where you want. As always, I thank you for listening. Well, with an Encore life, you can create value in the world beyond just winning that next pickleball game. As I said before, do the work you love when you want and where you want. You can live the dream just as I am. If you're ready to get started today, please contact me at lynn@lynnfreest.com. Today's episode is number 206, and it's titled Reflections on My Mother's 97th Birthday. So it's a little bit different. I'm not trying to provide any expert advice or whatever, but just reflecting on some information, things about my mother's life that has informed me. And it probably comes down to how do we look at transitions? How do we feel about them? Those kinds of, so for me, it's tied into how do we handle transitions? My mother was born on July 4th in 1926 in Davenport, Nebraska, very small town. And she just celebrated her 97th birthday. So at 97, she's seen almost 40% of U.S. history, 97 years out of 247. So her growing up years were in Nebraska during the Depression and the Dust Bowl. So some of the things she experienced was there's certainly no air conditioning at that time, but her mother would put wet sheets over the windows to cut down on the dust and maybe provide a little cooling as the air came through and evaporated. Now, in general, they had very little in their farming community, but she talks about how happy they were. They had a good life in her eyes, and yet you could see there were certainly challenges out there. And some of it came about because, as she said, she had a large family. They had a lot of extended family, but everybody was in the same boat. Life was hard. Farming wasn't really good. So they just had to make do with what they had. And I'll mention that later. They did have a windmill to pump water. And one of the interesting things, again, is comparing it to their life versus ours today. This windmill was also used to charge what they called a Delclo plant, which is a battery, and it created some electricity. And sometimes that electricity was used to run milking machines, or maybe it ran some lights or allowed them to listen to a radio. But by and large, this was before the time when there was electricity in rural areas. Also, they had outhouses and things like that. Another thing Mom talks about several times is they had a storm cellar, because in those days there were tornadoes. They weren't uncommon. She always remembers, though, that her dad, as they went to the storm cellar because there might be a threatening storm or a tornado, took the axe with him just in case a tree fell across the door or something like that. So it was certainly a different time. And so for me, that big lesson is when you have these kinds of challenges in your life, can you still be happy? And she, by and large, will go through story after story of the interesting things that her family did. She had great fun playing with her cousins. They were in a one-room school, and she actually advanced a grade because they didn't have anybody else her age. So they put her in with her older brother. They thought she could handle it. And so it's one of those interesting things that actually had put her ahead in school, even though, again, we would think of a one-room school as not having many resources. So it gets back to this whole idea of transitions. And it's easy to say, is today the worst ever? And is it really? So again, I go back and think about things. And I'm at 73 now, and certainly I've experienced different things in my life. So as we talk about this, is it really the worst ever? Or is it simply the worst that some people have experienced so far in life? So again, in my mother's case, they basically had to water their gardens and grow as much of their food as they could. They could get by. And it was interesting. She talks about her Christmas tree was a pine bough put in a can, because at the time they really didn't want to waste a precious tree on a holiday decoration. So this was, again, there's not many trees out in Nebraska at that time. But as I said earlier, extended family, many cousins. I was just recently going over with her the family tree as she remembered it, and it was 50, 60 people that she had reasonably often contact with in her area. And it's interesting here again, some of the things that she didn't experience in that depression area, I've heard about from other people. Again, she didn't experience this, but at the time, people who sold animal feed, they would put a print pattern on their bags so that people could save the bags and use that material for clothes. Again, something that we probably didn't go on for that long, but it was something unusual that we wouldn't even think of. Now she had to go through another transition because as she was graduating from high school, her family moved to a farm in Western Illinois, quite a ways away. She did have some relatives here. She was doing that, but she had graduated from high school and was ready to move on. Now, somehow, even though I'm sure her father and the family didn't have a lot of money, finances, they were able to allow her to go to college, a small Monmouth college in Western Illinois. And so she was able to go down there and start college. Now, it was interesting because she was in college during World War II. And at this small college, it was pretty full training military recruits. So she couldn't even live in the dorm because that's where the recruits were. She had to stay with some families in the local community. Again, she said it was a good time. And yet I'm sure there were challenges that she faced. Now, later on, made another transition, started going to the Iowa State University. And there she was studying to be a dietitian. And she met my father there, and they were married in 1948. And my father I won't go into his history, but he had an interesting history too. But he served in the Army Air Corps in India. So again, interesting how the two of them got together, and till my dad passed away about 20 years ago, they had a wonderful life. And I have 2 sisters and 3 brothers. And I'm the oldest, and my youngest sister is 10 years younger. We were a big family. Again, my dad was an engineer at John Deere, but my mother stayed home while we were kids. So it's interesting, then more transitions. She had a lot of 6 kids in 10 years. So it was an interesting life. Now, I will just say that my parents were social. They probably had this experience from both of them had large families. So we did things with other families, they tended to have 3, 4, 5 kids or whatever. So I got used to the idea of always having a lot of people around. And it's just different in today's world. The families are smaller, and that's nothing wrong with today, but obviously it was a different experience I had. It was one of the things because, again, with my dad being the sole income provider at that time. Now, he had a good job as an engineer. At the time, it's considered quite a good job. But my parents did things like, with 6 kids, you could only afford so much. But they took us camping across the country and camping on weekends. And so we got to see a lot of, especially the West, got all the way out to Seattle, got to San Francisco, got to LA, went up to Canada. So we got to see a lot of things on going across the country camping. Now, wasn't very fancy. And at that time, there, of course, was little or no air conditioning involved in even that. So it was hot. We normally went in June, July. And so it was interesting. Then I'll say just another comment on the resources my parents had. They always provided for us. We had gifts at Christmas and birthdays and stuff, but sometimes they were secondhand. That didn't make them any less fun for us. But I remember my dad, he knew somebody that had a train set they weren't using. So he bought the train set from them, and that was a Christmas present. Likewise, every year in that time, we often went ice skating. So he'd go down to the local sporting goods store where they had used ice skates. And it was probably just as well because we outgrew them really fast. But so it's, again, these transitions, it's one of those things that I go back to. I didn't even really think a whole lot about it at the time, just as my mother didn't think about her time in the Depression and the Dust Bowl. We had people, we had relationships, we had friends. And so that's what I look at today, again, as we think in terms of Encore careers or transitions that we're going to make. I keep coming back to, and I hear from other experts, that relationships are important. And I know one of my colleagues has said relationships are rocket ships in terms of business. And I've had other people say in terms of just having a long and healthy life, the key thing is having good relationships. So it's one of those things where I don't say any of this stuff it's a little personal history, but on the other hand, it's made me reflect on the fact that, okay, not everybody's had some of these close relationships. And for whatever reason, I've been blessed. My parents were blessed with having them. So it's one of those things where I think it's made me some resilient. It's made me maybe slightly reflective. It's made me more thinking about how others are and recognizing that it's not all about stuff sometimes. Again, going back to my mother's experience. So after all of us were full-time in school, she did return to her work as a dietitian, worked at a hospital, and that was just part of it. But she and my dad, all 6 kids, we went to college. We did different things after that, but we all did go to college. But then later on, Mom, again, devoted herself in the second part of her life to things like being a master gardener, being in service clubs, working with her church. And she did some work in hospice also. It's one of those things where she was really active, and it's only been in the last few years where her limited mobility has restrained her, and it's frustrated her to some extent that she can't get around because she dearly loved all these things she was doing with other people. And quite frankly, though, at 97, one of the dilemmas she has is that many of her friends are gone now. In fact, almost all of them are. So she still has younger friends, but that is, her circle of friends has narrowed somewhat. And that's too bad. That we do what we can to help her stay connected with family. But that's the one thing that I would say we haven't been able to keep her world as wide as maybe she'd like or we'd like to provide for her. The final thing I'll say, again, with respect to my mother, and one of the sayings she had from her, a couple sayings that she's had from her youth, it was what she said out there was, you use it up, you make it do, or you do without. Again, they were masters at just making do with what they had. And then later on in life here, she's just has a wonderful attitude. And what she says to people is, I'm in pretty good shape for the shape I'm in. And again, I can only hope to have her attitude and her interest and how she approaches life if I'm blessed with being 97. So this is not a really long episode, and it's kind of a different one. But I go back to this whole idea of going through transitions. Sometimes we get wrapped up in ourselves. I certainly do. And then I talk to her, get some perspective. And I think all of us, I know in different areas, they're talking about co-generations, having intergenerational conversations. I think that's a very valuable thing because obviously some of the skills and knowledge she learned in Nebraska on a farm isn't necessarily relevant to young people today. But some of the other wisdom around people and how to deal with things, how to handle transitions, all of that stays relevant no matter what time or era we're in. So, well, with that, I want to thank you for sharing this time together with me. And if you are interested in pursuing information around an Encore life, please contact me at lynn@lynnfrias.com or go to my website at lynnfrias.com. You can check out the podcast, and there are many other episodes there that you can see different aspects of what I've been trying to share with people. And so look forward to talking with you more in the future. And thanks again.